It's important to remember that when you're looking at the Wild West or the Western image, that's very much a minority thing. Very few Americans actually moved out and lived in the Western settlements. Very few, for example, cattle raising is not a population intensive industry. Mining never really included that many people. So despite the whole sort of image of folks moving out west to go into mining claims or all sorts of stuff like that, it was a relatively small proportion. The vast majority of folks, even during the gold rush, that are moving out west become farmers. And running parallel to this whole sort of Wild West town ethos is the reality of what most Americans were moving into if they weren't in urban areas. It's important to remember that the majority of Americans by the mid-late 19th century are in urban areas or in suburbs of them. Having said that, what you find is that was never seen as part of the American world. That's part of the European world. So the whole idea of the landscapes and built environments that make Americans American, I guess I came out right, was basically this idea of the small town. So it would be the American spin on, small town English society or something like that, but it looks radically different because it's, again, in large part, it has this sort of Puritan Calvinist stamp on it. So this was called, in most cases, Main Street. The huge number of towns in the United States, especially when you go from the Midwest west, where you actually have, it's called Main Street. And what you'll find is Main Street looks like Main Street. As we'll see in a second, I actually went to Marshalltown, Iowa, and Google and just literally looked for Main Street and dropped down on it, and bam, there's our perfect example. But in a very subtle way, this is actually a very complex environment, and it's radically different in many ways than our New England one. If you would, it's the next generation of the American community-based group environment where the collective hangout versus the Western town, which might be sort of a collection of individuals hanging out. And so the other part about the Main Street is this is permanent. So whereas the Western community was very much a temporary one, either the buildings changed or the people changed, or in many cases both changed, and in many cases disappeared. Your idea of Main Street is it was permanent. Main Streets weren't supposed to disappear. Main Streets were going to be there forever. And that was going to be what made America America, was Main Streets. And this is why we have so many political elections. They generally start in these small town areas where politicians will sort of stage these events so they can look like they're classically, typically American. And that requires you to be in a small town's main street. Now, by the late 70s, early 1980s, I was involved in some of this with the Historical Hawaii Preservation Society, is that there was a realization that small town main streets were disappearing. They were gone. By then already Kmart's, Walmart's, Target's, all these, the shopping mall, the shopping center was pretty much wiped out Main Streets. And in many towns, they were already trashed, still are in many cases. So the idea that you actually had to spend millions of dollars, and there was these huge grants from the federal government and preservation societies to basically save or restore Main Streets. This is still a big thing, and towns still do a lot of this. We got involved in some of this here in Hawaii. Front Street and Lahaina is a good example. I think we wrote a proposal for Waipahu, but I don't remember if it got accepted. They tried to do this in downtown Honolulu, which is sort of silly because it doesn't really fit the Main Street image, but anyways. So, when you're looking at this Main Street image, remember this is running parallel to that whole sort of Virginia City or Tombstone, Arizona Western image. So this is like your alternative. In many ways, you might think of this as the world that you leave to become wealthy and successful in the West. But it's also the world that after you become successful, this is the world that you move back to. So this is the world of permanence versus the Western world is the world of the temporary. So let's take a look at an example of one of these. Okay. Here's Marshalltown, Iowa. And like I said, I just really picked this name and, picked a town just because I sort of vaguely remember it. I remember hearing about it, never been there. But here you see it. This is literally Main Street. So this is the classic example. In many cases, this street would be renamed. So it might have had some name prior to this, but once Main Streets became a really big thing, is as many communities would rename this as Main Street to make it very clear that that's what this was. So if we rotate around here, notice the structures. Now, if you want to do this in sort of a classic way, if you want to visualize again, sort of, think for a second, flashback to what Virginia City looked like in that image we were looking at last time or a couple of times ago. And then compare that one to this one. The Virginia City was largely all wood, all temporary. Even the sidewalks were wood. The streets would have been mud and dirt. And so that was a world that, basically was sort of like a hotel, it was just something very ephemeral, very transitory. This, on the other hand, if you look at it, is a world that is anything but transitory. This is a world of permanence. Everything's going to be brick or stone. Everything's going to be really solid. Everything sort of feels like it's going to be there forever. Oh, here's classic right here. I can't even quite read the date there. 1908. So here's your classic sort of Main Street look. Now, in its own way, it's sort of interesting because it too, like the Virginia city, has a lot of pretensions. And if you think about it, it's a little bit different than the New England, where since it was pretty much hand built by the owner, the New England places didn't, other than the fact they had glass and stuff, really didn't have a lot of flash to them because most people just didn't have the technical skills. And to be honest, the community wasn't into flash. They were into moral correctness, if you want to. So here's another version, if you would. This is 100, 200 years later, interpretation of social political values and correctness. So basically, both of these are just brick boxes. But what you've done is you've put all sorts of little stuff on them to make them appear more than what they actually are. These serve absolutely no architectural function. They're entirely decorative. The fact this one actually has a plaque of the building date on it. This one here has some real fancy brickwork at the top. So all these places look different than each other. There's a modified one. But on the other hand, they're actually very similar because what they are is they're in contrast to Virginia City. This is a part of the world where these buggers are going to be here forever, at least when they're put up, that's the attitude. And the community that they're part of is going to be there forever. Let's go down the street here and take a look. That's interesting because I would have put it back. So in the modern context, you've tried to redo these bottom areas very poorly, I might point out. Very strange bottoms. But then once you get above here, second stories are still very, very late 19th, early 20th century. Here's what must have been a bank. It's the only option available. I would expect probably about the late 19th, early 20th century. Very typical of this, but again, most even your porticos on the bank serve no function. These are not structural elements. This whole thing is just basically stuck on the front of this box. And so the interesting thing about this, what everyone's trying to do is illustrate permanence. The porticos are sort of going to refer back to the fact that these are sort of vaguely Grecian. So you're going back to the whole fascination with the classical world, which was a big thing. But you're also implying that this is tied to the past. So, this sort of vaguely looks like the front of a Greek or Roman, temple. And it says something in the American context that it's a temple of money, because that's sort of the American logic. And so in that context, what you have is you have this permanent, but on the other hand, if you notice, a lot of these buildings basically have small false fronts. So in some ways, in a rather interesting way, they've sort of taken some of this whole Virginia city and tried to puff themselves up and make themselves more than they are. And this bank is a good example. It's not a bank now, but it must have been. Chinese, oh, it's a Chinese restaurant. Okay. And so what you've got here is this, if this were traditional in form, these would have been freestanding pillars. They would have been out here, and you would have had a much more expensive structure. This allows you to have the look of expense without the actual cost attached to it. So it's in own way, it's got some similarities to Virginia City and to pretense. But notice again, what the fabric of this whole place is very solid. It's very large, very permanent structures in a very permanent place. And so this town is supposed to be permanent. It looks like they're trying to do some restoration work here, but I'm not sure how. Obviously didn't think this through very well. But nonetheless, the upper areas have been restored. And I suspect it's probably through some sort of a grant from one of the Main Street projects. So what you've got is this whole sort of ethos. You notice how they come up with put in traditional, pseudo-traditional light poles, very typical of Main Street projects. So what you've got is a permanent sense of this place. This is the America of the town. This is the America of kids coming down here to get ice cream cones or whatever the hell kids would buy down here. But this is the urban core of the community. This is, if you would, the heart of the town. Now, the key part of that is that, unlike its New England counterpart, if you notice, the one thing that's real striking about all this is there aren't any residences. This is a world in which you have segregated where people live and things that and the places that they purchase or do things. So that's a nicely done top. Totally messed up bottom. So what you've done here is you've built a commercial district. This is very different than their European or Asian counterparts. The idea that you actually segregate or separate, and in many cases actually distance your commercial sector from your residential sector. But this was the function of Main Street. Main Street was very much like Virginia City, was for the purpose of making money, not through extraction or from the landscape, but basically, if you would, extraction from people. So what you had is people would live in these places. You would live other places. These would all be offices and stuff upstairs, probably still are. And this is what we call nowadays zoning. So the idea that you actually specified the particular areas of a landscape were used for particular functions was a very peculiar part of this whole sort of American idea of structuring the world. And again, when you think about it, it makes sense given the logic of the sort of Calvinist Puritans, that making money is good, working hard is good, and they're both manifestations of God's happiness, if you would, with you. And so this is a landscape where the people that own these buildings, the people that run that bank down there, the people that own these places, they're more successful. They're building owners, they're entrepreneurs, they're successful merchants. They're what do they call them, keystones or something of the community. I can remember what the technical term is. And what you get here then, of course, is that's got to be City Hall. I assume, sure looks like it. And so what you have here is the idea of a permanent, stable community. And manifest in that is the idea that all these permanent buildings are lined up around this and reflect this idea of wealth and prosperity, and most importantly, stability. So if Virginia City in the Western environment is an ephemeral, temporary environment, this is a permanent, stable environment. And one of the classic ways you see this, and let's segue out here just really quickly. Okay, we've now moved one block, I don't know which direction, away from Main Street. So if we go here, that's Main Street right up here. So we were just up there. We've now moved a block down. So if you notice what we do here is now wham, now we're in a residential district. If you want to see this classically, think of Palolo and Weil Avenue campus. Weil Avenue is a commercially zoned street. If you go a little more haphazard, but that's pretty much what it entirely is. If you turn a block off into Palolo, then bam, you're in a residential and you can't have businesses. So what you go is you go from one entirely different function, if you would, to another one in the space of a block. And that's so beloved of both this idea of organization and structure, but also sort of the Calvinist logic of place, which is bringing order into chaos. And so what you do is you bring order into chaos by putting residential districts, and the folks that originally would have lived in these homes would have walked a block or ride a horse or whatever, and gone up to their offices on Main Street. When they're done for the day, they come home. So you now entirely segregated your residential lifestyle from your commercial money-making lifestyle. And this is a huge part of what makes Main Street. And this is also why it's so difficult to keep Main Streets functional, especially in the online world that we live in the 2020s. It's hard to make a Main Street relevant in a world where this person sitting here is very likely shopping online on their phone. So why would they want to walk a block to Main Street? Well, how can a store in Main Street stay open if it's competing with Amazon and Target online and all the rest of those? But notice also how you get an entirely different architecture. The built environment of your residential districts is entirely different than that commercial. But if you notice, there's a lot of this residential district that looks very much, and in fact, is out of the ethos of our New England, our New England village or town. The idea of linearity and gridding, which you'll see on the Main Street. The idea of lawns. You don't see lawns on Main Streets. And Main Streets are functional, so they're going to have sidewalks, and originally they would have had parking areas for horses, wagons, and later cars. The look of these places is very much like a sort of hyper puffed up version of a New England home. And again, I would think these are probably from late 19th, early 20th century. I'm just guessing the way that this one looks. This one I'm not too sure about. But what you've got here is, in some ways, you've taken a New England home, if you would, and you've come up with a reinterpretation of it. But it's in an entirely new structured landscape. Whereas in New England, you would have businesses and homes all sort of mixed together. It's just a town, a community. And here you've sort of got different communities. You've got communities of residents, and you've got communities of business. And what you're also going to find in these communities of residents is very much they start segregating right from the get-go in terms of the relative wealth of the residents. Right, let's go down the block here. Here we go. Okay, here we see a fascinating example of sort of discordance between, relative wealth. I would suspect the person that originally lived in this house, probably a successful business person that had, Pierce Main Street again, had something up there. These houses certainly not so much. So what you start to get is, in fact, if we go down a couple of blocks, I'm willing to bet we're going to find something different. In fact, maybe we'll do that next time. What you start to see here is a major expressions of success and lack of success reflected in the residential landscape and in the commercial landscape. So in a much more explicit way than we saw earlier, this is people basically saying, I've made it in the world, or I haven't. This family originally had made it in the world. These families hadn't yet, or maybe never would. And this becomes a huge part of the American landscape. Main streets are interesting because in many ways they're seen as modern American sort of stereotypes of what makes America us. But in many ways, when you start to look at them, they're actually sort of not grim, they're pretty telling in terms of what they say about us and the values that we have.